As I'm sure many of you are painfully aware, I am not often certain about things. There is something I am confident about, though, and that is that if you ever organize a church barbecue, you might want to think twice about asking Jesus to look after the catering. You see, his plan appears to be, well, what have we got here? Oh, look, 5 loaves and 2 fish. That'll be enough. I think if our parish council said that that's going to be their approach to each of our social gatherings, probably there would at least be some raised eyebrows and a little bit of grumbling. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Jesus doesn't worry about beginning with enough. He always begins with whatever is already there. It makes me wonder what you like best about this story. I wonder what is most important to you in this story. I wonder where you are in this story. I wonder what the disciples felt as they collected the leftovers. I wonder what Jesus hoped they would understand. I wonder why this story was so important that all 4 of our gospel writers included a version of this story in their books. You know, the older I get, the less interested I become in having all the answers. I think it's because I'm wise enough to know that isn't possible. I am more interested, though, in asking good questions and in hearing the great questions that surface from others. If you don't believe me, come to Bible study on Tuesday night. Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus had just received heartbreaking news. We miss it by just a little bit in that gospel passage. But he says after he heard this, and you could be wondering, after he heard what? Well, what he heard was the news that his cousin, who we call John the Baptist, had been killed. So Jesus wanted to slip away to a deserted, lonely place to be by himself. And don't we all know lonely places? Sometimes they're geographically located, like a hospital room or a funeral home or a quiet house after everyone has gone home. Sometimes they are places inside us, where grief lives, where anxiety keeps us awake, where we question whether we are enough, or worry, will there be enough? Jesus went looking for solitude, but when he arrived, he found thousands of people who had brought their own loneliness with them. People carrying fear, illness, empty stomachs, and empty hearts. And Jesus did something extraordinary. He did not protect himself from their need. Instead, his grief somehow enlarged his compassion. And that personally strikes me very deeply. Because grief can do at least one of 2 things. It can close our hearts, or it can make them spacious enough to recognize the suffering of others. And perhaps that is the first miracle in today's gospel story. Years ago, my wife Sue Ann and I served at a church in a neighborhood that decided to host a regular weekly community meal. As we planned the first supper, we worried constantly. We've all been through this, whether it's pancake supper or not. Well, are 50 people going to show up? Are 100 people going to show up? What if we run out of food? That's what we were worried about. One of the older adults, I'll just put it that way, on our organizing team said, well, then we'll just have to maybe give them smaller portions. And then she added, I lived through the Depression. I learned something then. People can survive eating a little less. What they can't survive is believing that no one cares whether or not they eat. Week after week, people came. Sometimes there was more than enough food, enough even for people to take some home with them at the end of the night. Sometimes there was just enough. And once or twice, we nearly ran out, or we ran out of a particular item. I remember one night we ran out of peas, of all things, and people were very disappointed. But no one seems to remember those evenings because of the menu or the amount of food. What they remember is they remember those evenings because strangers became friends. People who arrived alone and for the first time even sat around tables with people who learned their names. So loneliness began to shrink. Hope began to grow. And I really believe that was a miracle too. You know, people have spent centuries debating what happened with the bread and the fish that day, right? Did Jesus physically multiply them? Did he wave his hands over them and suddenly there were more? Did people who had hidden their lunches begin sharing them with others? Or was it something else entirely? These are all good questions. And I honestly have no idea what the answer is to that question. Life and God are mysteries beyond my understanding. But I do know this. Every miracle in the Gospels tells us something about the heart of God. And this miracle tells us that God's economy is very different from ours. The world teaches scarcity. We hear it every day. Protect yourself, protect your own. There is not enough for everyone. Jesus teaches abundance. Always. Notice what he asks and what he does not ask. He does not ask, "What don't you have?" He asks, "What do you have?" It's a completely different question. It's a completely different frame of thinking. So what were there? Well, there were 5 loaves and 2 fish, and I was going to do numbers, but I don't have 12 fingers. But anyway, 12 disciples, apostles, who kept walking back and forth with the baskets, a crowd willing to sit together instead of scrambling over one another to get to food. And somehow, there was enough. Now, I wonder why Jesus asked everyone to sit down before receiving any food. My training comes back to me right away, and it's, could be the fact that it's good manners, but that's just maybe because that's what my mother taught me, and I'm sure other mothers taught the same thing. Maybe it's because people stop looking and feeling like competitors once they become neighbors. Maybe community is itself part of the miracle. Every Sunday, like we're doing right now, we practice this miracle. We come carrying different lives when we walk through the door. Some arrive joyful, some exhausted, some grieving, some hopeful, some wondering whether we still belong. Yet Christ keeps inviting us to one table. Not because we all believe the same things. I can assure you that's the case. Not because we have all the answers. I can also assure you that's the case. But because love, Christ's love, is bigger than certainty. Around this table behind me, we discover that God's abundance isn't measured only with bread. It's measured in kindness, in forgiveness, in welcome, in inclusion, in compassion, in courage, and in hope. Perhaps the greatest miracle is not that bread multiplies. Maybe the greatest miracle is that hearts do. So this week, I leave you with a few more wondering questions. I wonder where your lonely place is today. I wonder who around you is carrying a loneliness no one else can see. I wonder what small gift you are holding that seems too little to matter, or at least too little to matter to you. Perhaps it's a smile, a listening ear, a phone call, a meal, an invitation, a prayer, presence, or a word of encouragement. I wonder what might happen if you trusted enough to place that small gift into God's hands and let God work with that small gift. Because this much I do believe with all my heart. Love is one of the few things that God created that grows only by being given away. And it can grow exponentially. When we dare to share what little we have, we often discover that God has been creating abundance all along. So for the miraculous abundance, created and shared by the God who loves every one of us, and who calls us to share that abundance with one another always, thanks be to God. Amen.